The redistricting process plays a critical role in the distribution of political power and has become a flashpoint for growing conflicts between the major parties. Now that the 2020 census data has been officially released, states are creating new congressional and legislative maps. Stan Forbes, who is one of the original 14 members of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission and served as its chair, will provide us with personal insights into the process and how it will affect our future elections. And now we'd like to welcome Mr. Forbes.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. And one housekeeping item for me is that if you hear a beep in the background occasionally, I can't shut that off. That's telling me that an email has come in, so just ignore it. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk on this subject because my experience as a commissioner was one of the most rewarding parts of my life, and I think it made a difference. But going back, redistricting actually has been controversial for a long time. The Constitution originally set out that each representative was to represent 30,000 people, and there were 65 altogether if you added up the 13 original states. This number has never been fixed, though. It has gone on, and every 10 years when we have a census, as the Constitution requires, we're supposed to redistrict the various seats. But there's no constitutional requirement as to the size or how many or any of that kind of stuff. And so every year except one, every census except one, the number of representatives has increased. And in the past, it's been done by the legislature. And up until 1941, the legislature, each 10 years, would look at the census and determine how many seats there should be and how they should be distributed. This became more of an issue as the country urbanized, became a real split between the urban and rural because the rurals were getting cut out in terms of representation. In fact, in 1920, the Congress was not even able to allocate or create new districts. So the 2020, there was no redistricting. So we went from, and at that time we had 391 seats. But in 1929, the Congress established the amount of 435 seats. But in order to avoid the issue of who gets to allocate these, that was turned over to the executive branch in 1941. So since 1941, it's been the executive branch that's determined how many seats each person gets, how many each state gets. The formula basically works like this. There are 6 states that only get one. Every state gets one no matter what the population is. So like Wyoming or North Dakota, they only get one. The others are divided by the population and number of remaining seats into the total population that the census identifies. And so that means it's currently a new seat represents about 760,000 people. Varies a little bit state to state, but that's the rough number. And of course, that's a problem because it's a very large district. It's very hard to maintain contact with that many people, but that is the fixed number and it is set by statute. Well, the battle has shifted from how many seats states get to how they're going to be divided up within the state. And that's where gerrymandering has come about. But now gerrymandering has been around since almost the beginning of our republic. The very first veto by the president dealt with redistricting and gerrymandering. And the term gerrymander came about in the early 19th century in the state of Massachusetts when the governor drew a district that was shaped like a salamander, and his name was Jerry. And so the press came up with the word gerrymander that represents a district that has a very strange shape in order to achieve a certain political result. So what a gerrymander is a drawing of a district that will ensure a particular party will win that seat. And by the opposite is that it'll cut out the other party if at all possible. How is it done? Well, I have this is my graphic. I don't do PowerPoint, so it's my graphic. But this shows that if you have as few as 60 voters, 30 of each kind, but you control the process and there's 6 seats, you can ensure that you're going to win 5 seats and they're only going to win 1, even though they have the same number of voters. So what you simply do is pack one district. It's up here, which you put 10 of the other party in it. and then you distribute your votes among the other five and their votes among the other five, and you win the other 5 seats on a 6-4 vote.
Stan, I'm going to interrupt you just a little bit. That was a little too close to the camera and they couldn't see all
Okay.
of it. So back, there you go. That's better. Thank you.
That's right. Just okay.
Mhm.
Again, if you have a situation where you have 6 seats and each side has 30 voters, I can guarantee that I will win 5 seats and you're only going to win 1, even though we have the same number of votes. And what that does is that I put 10 voters of the other party into 1 seat. And then I simply distribute their votes, which remain 4 each in each of the other 5, and mine, which represents 6 in each of the other 5, and I'll win every seat. And so that's basically what gerrymandering does on a large scale. Why is gerrymandering bad? Right, we gerrymander, so what? Well, there's a couple of things that gerrymandering does. First of all, and most important, it turns the political process on its head. It makes a situation where the politicians are picking their voters rather than the voters picking their politicians. Is that bad? Well, I think it is. I mean, I think most people would like to have their vote. I mean, there's one person, one vote, but it's important to have your vote be meaningful. And if you've been put into a gerrymandered district, your vote is meaningless functionally. You get to vote, but it's not going to change anything. Second of all, that leads to the primary of an election being the real election in the district. And primaries tend to bring out the most radical, most extreme of the party, of either party. And since there tend to be low turnout votes, the most extreme then gets elected. And so it really exacerbates our partisan divisions. Let's see. Well, again, it undercuts the democratic process, and again, it creates for a very more partisan situation. Well, that happened in spades. So it's actually become worse because up until 2000 or thereabouts, the sophistication of the ability to parse the voters was not like it was today. With the computers and computer programs, there's an incredible amount of data on how people are going to vote. And so that makes the gerrymandering process much more scientific, if you will, if you want to be in control. The Republicans figured out in the year 2000 that they needed to control the state legislatures because it's the state legislators that drew all the lines. And so they made a big point of winning state seats in state legislatures. And so they have both houses and the governor. And right now, the number of seats that Republican state only have, they have 179 seats versus 65 Democratic seats, which are completely controlled. So they can draw the maps for those 170 seats or 175 seats without any Democratic input at all. Well, remember, you only need 218 seats to have a majority in Congress. So the battle really shifted to redistricting and who's going to draw the lines. Well, California was a little different because California in the year 2000 created what was a gerrymandered map, but it was gerrymandered to protect incumbents. This is a little different from the straight gerrymandering. In this case, the map was drawn to protect all the incumbents. And from 2000 to 2010, there were 765 elections in California for legislators. 1 changed hands. Now that's a pretty effective map when you only get 1 out of 765 elections that make a difference. So the League of Women Voters and Common Cause in California made a real effort in the 2000 to 2010 era to reform the system and make it a fairer system, something that wasn't so sclerotic. Well, so, but the legislature was having none of it because the legislatures, and California is not unique in this regard, were not the least bit interested in giving up the power. So in 2008, the League of Women Voters and Common Cause put a ballot measure together, Prop 11, and it was going to give the authority to draw the state legislative districts to an independent commission. And that passed by a hair, but it did pass. In 2010, they put together one that would also give this commission authority to draw the congressional districts. And at the same time, interestingly enough, the Democrats tried to have their own ballot measure that would get rid of the commission altogether. The public wasn't having it, and they gave the congressional authority to the commission on a 61% to 39% vote, which in California is a huge landslide. The California system became really the gold standard now. To talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the process really was successful for about 4 or 5 reasons. One, it was an incredibly selective process. 36,000 people applied and 14 were picked, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 declined to state. In addition, the commission had to agree, every group of the commission had to agree on the maps. So you had to have the Democrats agree with the Republicans, agree with the independents. That was in contrast to Arizona, which was the other independent commission at the time. And it had been established actually in 2000, but it made what I consider to be a serious mistake. In that case, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and an independent chair were put on the commission by politicians. And as a consequence, you end up with a 2-2 vote consistently with one chair making the deciding vote. Whereas in the California system, all 3 groups had to agree before the map could be approved. Another thing about the selection process of the 14 of us was that all of us were utterly committed that the process is going to succeed. Unlike politicians, when they appoint people, those people may or may not care if the process succeeds because that just usually kicks back to the legislature. So in fact, when we sat down to have our first meeting, we were told that everybody within, this is in Sacramento, everybody within 10 blocks of this building wants you to fail and expects you to fail. And so because the power structure did not want us to be successful. The other thing that made the process very successful was that we were not allowed to consider any political information, no registration. We didn't care where the incumbents lived. In fact, we were not even allowed to know. They were not even allowed to talk to us, except in a public microphone. And everything we did was transparent, everything. We couldn't have a meeting outside with anybody. Everything had to be in front of the cameras, in front of the microphone, so the public could see every single thing that happened. And later on, we got an award for being the most transparent process in the country and also being actually the most competitive as well. So we drew maps, and also we engaged the public. One of the criteria we had was to draw these maps, we had to be under community of interest. Now, people say, why don't you use a computer? In a state as diverse in California, you can't do something like that because we're so different. I mean, the interests of the people of Northern California, our ag area of Northern California, are simply not the same as the interests of inner city Los Angeles. So you can't have a system that accommodates both of those. So we received 2,200 public comments at the microphone and 22,000 written comments about people's community of interest. And we used that data to integrate to create the maps that community of interest were kept together as best we could. It is hard though when you've got to make districts that are over 700,000 people. I mean, they end up being, and now this year it's 760,000. So it becomes very large. But this process that we did was considered to be the gold standard. What that meant was that we were invited to compete in a competition at Harvard School of Government, Kennedy School of Government. And we were competing against 500 other programs that could be used to benefit the public discourse. And we won. And the prize was $100,000 to be used to spend to go elsewhere, all over the country. Anybody asked us, Common Cause was our primary beneficiary of this, to come and talk to people about what we had done in California. We weren't trying to sell our model, but we wanted to let them see what we were in fact could do. It was an incredibly rewarding process. So in 2018 and 2019, and actually I made a trip in February of 2020, just before COVID, to Michigan. We gave multiple speeches to groups, to legislatures, anybody who wanted to hear from us about how we did it. Learned a couple of things about that. We are so fortunate to have the initiative process. Again, that's how we did ours in 2008, and Arizona did theirs in 2000. The public used the public initiative process. Are you picking up outside voices?
Yeah, we're getting some sound from some people. It sounds like, do you have an office door there?
No,
Or?
no, I don't, but I'll
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you, Stan. That's helpful.
I'm in my store, so I have only limited control over what's going on.
Gotcha.
Anyway, a couple of things I learned. First of all, most of the states I went to were on the East Coast. I think we went to 10 or 11 states altogether. Political reform in the original 13 colonies ended with the defeat of King George. I mean, the public has no right to do anything back there. I mean, and the legislature can ignore the public and does. Second of all, in my view, this is harsh, but I consider to be the legislatures we talk with to be incredibly venal, and they really do not want the public to be involved. They don't care about the public. I'll give you a couple of stories. I was speaking to the Republicans in Pennsylvania, and I start with my presentation by saying, voters don't care per se who wins. They want to have a meaningful vote. That's all. And the legislators just couldn't get their head around that we didn't care who won, that we just cared about voting, I mean, having a meaningful vote. They just really couldn't deal with that. Another occasion, also in Pennsylvania, there was a wonderful volunteer woman out of Philadelphia who was, I mean, the most energetic person I've ever run into. She had created a body trying to get the legislature to adopt a commission. And she had 18,500 volunteers she'd recruited. She'd had 450 public meetings. She'd got 250 jurisdictions to send petitions to the legislature to at least consider the issue. She couldn't even get a hearing by the appropriate legislator. And his comment was, I'm not going to hold a hearing because I'm not interested. Lastly, an example would be one that happened to me in Maryland. I was speaking to the Maryland Senate. And I start out my presentation by saying, remember, these seats don't belong to you, they belong to the public. He turned his back on me. I thought that said just volumes about the attitude of the legislature toward the public. I'll tell you a couple of other stories too that came up during the decade of 2010 to 2020. North Carolina was one of the most egregious gerrymanderers, and Common Cause sued them because although the voting for congressional seats was about 50-50, actually slightly more Democrats than Republicans, but the Republicans controlled the legislature. And so they generated a map that was 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Well, Common Cause sued. And at the state level, the state senator, the Republican state senator who actually manipulated the map or created the map, was asked, why did you come up with a map that was 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats when the vote's 50-50? And his answer was, I can't come up with a map that's 11-2. And also he thought it was, in his view, it was more important that Republicans win than Democrats. And so it was okay. That was his justification. The public opinion didn't matter to him. It's what he thought and what was going to keep the Republicans in power. It was interesting enough that that case actually went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which decided in 2019 that the federal courts had no role in correcting gerrymandered districts. That was a question to be left to the legislature, which to me was absolutely the fox being in charge of the henhouse. Justice Kagan's dissent is worth reading in that case. I'll find out what was the case. Wait, the 20 Rucho, R-U-C-H-O versus Common Cause, 2019 decision. Well, that brings us to today. Our commission has done a very good job, but they went through the same vetting process that we did. They had to apply the same criteria, but they had to deal with a couple of special problems, which I think made it very difficult to be a commissioner at this time. One, of course, was COVID. So much of what we did was a function of in-person conversation, public coming and testifying to us, and our being able to read them and ask and find out what was on their minds. COVID eliminated that. They had to do it by Zoom. Here we are. They had to do it in written format. We got a lot of written stuff, but it's just not the same as having the public come and you have a chance to talk to you. The other thing they had to deal with was that we lost a seat because of our population growth had been lower than it had been in the past. For the first time, California went from 53 congressional seats to 52, and that changes the mix on the ground. Also, the other thing that made it very hard was that the census data came in late because of COVID, and so the amount of time they had to draw the map, get input and draw the maps was compressed. That when we actually had passed the our maps, we had written up some recommendations, and under the law we could write these as laws, and the legislature could either adopt them or not, but they couldn't change them. And what we did is we felt we didn't have enough time or enough money, and we put those back into the process for the next commission. But they in turn lost that time because the census data was late. Normally it comes out in April, it came out in August, and that made it really, really tight. But they were successful in drawing a map. Now, some people complain about it, but again, when you have to get 760,000 people into a district, and some of the parts of the state are not very populated, relatively speaking, you end up with very large districts and you got to go with population someplace. And you'll see a district, there's been complaints in Sacramento about splitting Sacramento, because Sacramento's always had its own district. And it's because to come up with a northern district, you had to come down and grab some of Sacramento's population to get to the 760,000 people. But now how is the rest of the nation done relative to the gerrymandering issue? Well, there's been some good news and there's some not so good news. Again, the states that don't have the initiative have had a tough time. And they spend a lot of time in court. Here's an example. I told you the example about North Carolina. So the legislature made the map again, this time went to the state Supreme Court, but it did not go to the federal courts because the Supreme Court said the federal courts aren't to have no role in this. And so the state court ruled in favor of the Democrats, that the Republican map that was going to make it 11-3 were unconstitutional. Denial of equal protection to the voters. And so that has been, it was turned over to a special master, which is typically what the courts do, who looked at the basic criteria of population and communities of interest and not registration. And they divided the map up into, it's considered to have 6 Republican districts, 6 Democratic districts, and 2 toss-up districts, which is a fair result for what North Carolina should be. Then there was Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had been 18-5, 18 Republicans, 5 Democrats, even though the Democrats had at least as many votes as Republicans, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but they have been locked into a 13-5 split. And that's what the Republican legislature sent to the governor, who vetoed it. And it went back to the courts to decide. And the courts gave the legislature 2 weeks to just come up with a fair map. No luck. So they appointed a special master who came out of Stanford, looked at the data, and created 17 districts, as Pennsylvania also lost a seat, that are considered to be fairly balanced. Another court was the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio has been trending Republican, but they had 16 House seats, and again the votes were roughly equal, but the Republican legislature and the commission that they had created which was basically packed with political appointees, which was unable to agree on a map. Used the old map, was 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And the court said you can't do that. So they came up with a map that more equally to balance the legislature. Now, these are important because last year, if you read the press and such about this issue, there was a lot of concern about Republicans just rolling over the Democrats just based on redistricting. They didn't have to win another vote, but just by drawing the lines, they could change the outcome of the elections. And the court's decisions have really saved them. Other issues that have made the gerrymandering issue not quite so explosive for Democrats or explosive generally was that they did a wonderful job of gerrymandering themselves in those states that didn't have any sort of initiative or personal review. 2 examples. New York lost a seat, maybe they have lost 2, I forget. But they redrew their lines and they eliminated 5 Republican seats. So that will now become Democratic seats just by gerrymandering. Illinois eliminated 2. They lost a seat. And so there's going to be 2 more Democrats and 1 fewer Republicans coming out of Illinois. However, Republicans are not, you would not consider them to be clean hands, shall we say. And the best, I think the Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and cases, you give examples of those. But beyond that, they have Texas. Texas is unique unto itself. Texas gained 2 congressional seats in this redistricting time. And you would expect 95% of the population increase in Texas has been people of color, mostly Latino. There's no new Latino seats in Texas. They made two more Republican seats. Now, one thing the Republicans did not do, and this is pretty much nationwide, they could have gone for more districts and made them slightly pinker rather than dark red. But this is particular in Texas. Austin was a big liberal city, and it had 1 Democratic seat, but it also influenced 5 other seats around it, and they were trending purple as a consequence of Austin's growth. Well, what the Republicans did, like my example, they packed all the Democrats into 1 seat in the middle of Austin, and then distributed the remaining Democrats into 5 other districts, so that they're completely diluted. That's called cracking. It's a term for that. And so what they did was that these 5 seats that were around Austin, 4 had been becoming competitive. Not anymore. They're all now solid red seats. Also, if you look at the map of the Texas lines, they go all the way from Austin all the way down to the Mexican border in strips. Another thing they did in Texas was they would go out the freeways to grab certain populations that they wanted to have in a certain district. So Texas was really, it's just quite unique unto itself. And of course, with a dominant legislature and a Republican governor, slipped right through. Now, the Department of Justice has sued Texas over the issue of racial gerrymandering. Now, the Supreme Court said you can't deal with partisan gerrymandering. Federal courts can't do that, but they can still deal with racial gerrymandering. So the fact that all the growth in Texas has been with the Latinos, and there's no new Latino seats, is evidence that that this was perhaps racially gerrymandered. Now, we were very careful about that in California when we did the maps in 2000 and 2011, I guess, to actually do the maps. We were aware of the great Latino growth between 2000 and 2010. Of course, it hadn't been picked up at all in 2000 with this protect incumbent maps. But in 2010, we were very well aware of that. And we had data of, we had to pay attention to Latinos of voting age, because so many Latinos in California are here without papers. They cannot vote. So you could put 50% of the people in a district could be Latino, and they still couldn't elect anybody. So we had to, if you will, add extra people to be sure there's enough Latino voters that they could elect someone of their choice. Now, in order to do that, we brought in a very high price, I might say, lawyer from San Francisco who sat in the room with us for the month we drew the maps. And every time we come up with a map, we basically turn to him and say, how do we do? Are we going to withstand a challenge on racial discrimination? And he would sign off and tell us, well, maybe not, maybe need to add something here. And so we never got sued by MELDEF or the NALEO, the various Mexican American or Latin Mexican American Legal Defense Fund folks who were just there chomping at the bit to sue us. But we were so careful that in the end, they chose not to sue us because they did well by the fact that they were able to add a bunch of Latino legislators in Congress. Now, one thing I want to make a comment about the Voting Rights Act when we were doing this, and I'll go back to where we are today. The most difficult issue for the commission was how to handle Los Angeles, because traditionally there have been a certain number of African American legislators coming out of LA, but then there was this increase in Latinos in LA that we had to recognize, and so we had the option of eliminating an African American congressional seat, state senate, and state assembly seat. We could do that, and could justify completely and replace them with Latino seats. But we had a big debate on that. Was the thing we had the biggest debate on, and we almost didn't pass the map because our two African American members said they were not going to use the Voting Rights Act, which is created to protect Black political power, to use it to diminish Black political power in California. They just weren't going to do it. And so we sort of argued, and they also had Representative Waters and Representative Bass come and speak to us, and their comments were, we don't need to have solid Black districts, so we could distribute the Black vote further among more seats, because they had developed coalition districts where they were a minority of Black voters. They sorry about the freight train. They're get elected even though they weren't the majority Black districts. We didn't have to create majority Black districts for them. So the end result of all this was that recently, I just read this week, that after all the machinations, now Florida has not yet completed the map. It shows you how they influence. The governor presented his own map. I should say one other comment that people tried to do. Florida voters tried to get the legislature to draw fair maps by creating criteria. Well, the legislators ignored those, and for the lawsuits that said you had to change the maps. So using criteria and then trusting the legislature is just not a viable option. So anyway, where we are today is that, depending on who's reporting it, the Brennan Center is a wonderful source of information on this kind of stuff. So is Politico. But what's the status of things? There's either 218 Republicans leaning seats against 217 Democratic leaning seats, or the reverse, 218 Democrat to 217 Republican. So the net result of this gerrymandering, or this redistricting, pardon me, I won't call it automatically gerrymandering, district, has been to end up at least a playing field that is relatively even. And so the election will turn on other issues rather than gerrymandering. Gerrymandering was not able to be used this time by powers that be to change the election results, to deny people the right to vote, the meaningfulness of their vote. And I think that's a good thing. And if you look at it in 2012, when President Obama was president, at that point, the Republican had districts in their favor of 240 against 195 Democratic bases. So the process, because of the courts, because of commissions, and the public sensitivity, has somewhat, for the moment, seems to have, on a national basis, overcome the issues that come with gerrymandering. Now, in an individual state, not so. And of course, I've only been talking about congressional districts, but the same things apply to state legislatures as well. So, we can keep our fingers crossed, but at least it appears at this point that the election in the fall of this year will turn on issues other than gerrymandering. Gerrymandering won't magically, won't affect the result significantly. There's a lot more safe seats on both sides, so that's unfortunate. Because in California, when we drew our maps, we became much more competitive. As I'd said, we only had one seat change hands in 10 years between 2000 and 2010. In the 2012 election, 7 congressional seats changed hands. And then in 2014 and 2016, the Republicans won 3 of them back. So they were truly swing districts. But the number of swing districts now in the country is probably down to as few as 40. Because both sides have started gerrymandering themselves into safe districts. I think that's to our disadvantage, but that's just the way it is. And with that, I open it up to questions. I'd be happy to answer anything I can take a shot at.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you. We have a number of questions, and I think everyone is interested in more and more details. Not that you didn't, give us a fair amount of details, but there's still interest in more. One of the phrases you talked about was a community of interest. Could you explain a little bit more about what that is?
Yes. As I said in my example, was that California is a big state. People have different interests. As I said, farmers in Northern California do not have the same interest as inner city Los Angeles. Coastal concerns don't have the same kind of concerns as foothill. Let me give you an example. We do a couple of districts. We had our hearings. We had people come from the foothills, like Mariposa and Auburn, and come to us and say, look, because those districts had been, at that point, were running east-west. So they were linked with valley communities. They said, look, our issues are watershed, fire, recreation. Whereas the valley is concerned about agriculture for water for agriculture, pesticides and things like that. We don't have the same interests. So we created a foothill district just so that their interests of recreation and fire and watershed issues could be addressed. We also drew districts that Monterey Bay had been split into 2 districts. We put those together because they have the same sort of environmental issues. Same with Lake Tahoe. One of the most interesting ones was that was one in Long Beach. So and this is where you get from public testimony that we would never have gotten. Long Beach, the Port of Long Beach is the largest port in the West Coast. And all the freight truck, hopefully, all the trucks go up the 710 up into LA and up to be distributed throughout the state. That has tremendous air pollution. The people who live there were not represented by anybody who cared about air pollution, the diesel air pollution. So we created a district that gave them an opportunity to elect somebody that could be their issue, and they'd have somebody to talk to about how that could be reduced. So we would find issues like that you would never know about unless the people told you. Oh, and one other one. I mean, we all knew about Napa Valley and Sonoma Valley and winemaking, all that kind of stuff. So we drew a line, but we left out the warehousing area of the region, which was so important to the wine growing industry. Well, they came and told us that the warehouses should be engaged, should be in the same district as the wineries. We would never have known that. And so they told us that, and after we passed our second round of maps, we put the warehouses into the same district as the wineries. So those are sorts of things.
So you've talked about some of the things. Is it, and you mentioned the wine growers, grape growers referencing the warehouses. How does the commission decide which areas to pay attention to and create communities of interest, which you just kind of like, never mind?
Fair question. We got asked that question. I think that came out of the vetting process that we were picked, because we had to talk about the importance of inclusion, and we had to write essays and this kind of stuff and talk about it because we had 90-minute live interviews. It's a value system. Let me give you an example. We held a hearing in San Diego and we held a hearing in Palm Springs, what to do with the folks who lived in the Salton Sea area, if you will. We could have come up with a Republican district by focusing on Palm Springs, or we could come up with a more Democratic district by focusing on the farm workers and agriculture workers down around San Diego. We decided that we're going to go with the district that helped the farm workers more than Palm Springs. And our rationale was this: the people in Palm Springs know how to work the system. They know how to get themselves influenced. The farm workers do not. And so it's more important that we lean toward the farm workers. Another example, we had a debate in, we'll call it the flats of Oakland, the flatlands, Richmond, and that area of the state. We tended to favor those people who were functionally poorer and less engaged in the political workings and machinations of the society. And so if we had to make calls like that, we sort of went with the more what I won't call them underprivileged, more exposed, more vulnerable, if you will, to use the phrase of the day. Another thing that we did, and this I took a lot of responsibility for this. I was determined we were going to have 2 agricultural seats in Northern California, because I mean we could have drawn that there could be none. If you radiate out of Sacramento and take the population out of Sacramento and spread it north, you're not going to have any agricultural seats at all. And I thought it was important and to have the agricultural seats agricultural part of the state represented. And that was done really more so even in the San Joaquin Valley, but because there's more people, and so it was easier to draw smaller districts there. But it was a value system, and other people had different values. Looking at the commissioners, so you absolutely applied your own personal value system. You had to, because you did have to make choices like that, particularly when you have so big districts. The other thing we tried to do, if we were not able to meet the needs of one group in a certain map, state senate map or assembly map, we tried to let them have more, keep together and give them something in another map at a different level. So we tried very hard examples. The East Asian community in Fremont, they wanted their own seat. We couldn't give them one at the state senate level, but we could work on getting them mostly one in a House seat, for the state House. We tried very hard to protect the gay population in San Jose, not split it up. It is what it is. In Los Angeles, we were aware of Koreatown and Japantown and the Vietnamese in Orange County. We created one Asian district, but we tried to keep them together at some level so they would not be split up, and so such political power as they had would be kept together to be applied in the district they ended up being in. So those are some of the things we just values.
Does the entirety of your information come from the census or from other sources as well?
I mean, we take the census. I mean,
okay.
It is what it is. They talk about, well, you undercount this or undercount that. No, this is the number we deal with. We're not going behind the number, and that's just, just the way it is. I mean,
okay.
we're not in a position to do that.
So I'm just, pardon me, I'm looking at some of the, so one of the questions which I can almost imagine your answer to it is, has anyone looked at using a computer algorithm?
Absolutely. I mean, we've asked that question before, and we rejected that out of hand because you can't make one. You can do it for Iowa probably, but you can't do it for California. We're too diverse, we're too spread out, our communities of interest are too different. And so we let the public define what they viewed as their community of interest. We're not going to use an algorithm because the algorithm can't deal with all the issues that are out there as people define themselves. It's just not possible. And besides, I think also, this is a personal statement, but is that people don't have much, I think in this day and age, feel they don't have much control over their lives. And they don't want a computer putting them into a box. They want the opportunity to come and look me in the eye at the microphone and say, damn it, I want you to do this because this I care about that community, and I'm not what some computer tells me. And so the public have the right to the ability to do that. And I think that's an important part of small d democracy.
One of the questions was about the scope of districts that your commission addressed. And if you could respond to that, whether the state level, local level, national level, et cetera.
What do you mean by scope? Size?
No. U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, State Assembly, State Senate, franchise, Board of Equalization.
We do 4 math. We don't do the Senate math because every state gets 2 senators regardless.
Oh, right. Okay.
So we did the 53 congressional seats. We did the 40 Senate seats. We did the 80 House seats in the State House. And we did the 4 Board of Equalization seats. We went through them all. And again, as I said, we first of all, we did all 40 seats, all 80 seats for the Assembly. We worked our way up. And then we did the Senate seats, and then we did the congressional seats. Again, using that opportunity to, if I didn't give you this, I'll try to give it to you over here as best we could. Consistent with, the thing that makes House seats tricky is that by the courts have told us they have to be an equal population within one person. Out of 703,000 people for us, 760 for the current commission. And I mean, you got your census tracts with this many people. You take 5 away over here, you got to put 3 in over here. I mean, and you have map makers who's got all that data for you, and then they'll move stuff around as you tell them to do it. That's so they just move stuff around. But they never did anything to say, well, you can do this. They would say we'd have census tracts with population in them, and we would do the moving, and they would just sort of slide stuff around the map.
One of our attendees has asked about whether you have examples of the redistricting maps, or maybe you could just say how to locate them on.
Oh, yes. Well, Politico has a great website, and you can also to the California Citizen Redistricting Commission, and it'll pop up. It'll tell you about it, and it'll also tell us about the previous commission as well. It's all there. But you can find transcripts of what was said. You can find copies of communications. You can find, it's all there. California Citizens Redistricting Commission. Now on the national electoral level, the Brandon Center is as good as any, or Politico is a good. Politico's got every state broken down by district. As to, so do I have the California one? Let's see. I thought I had the California one here. Maybe not, but anyway, they've got really good stuff like that. And I use some of that to prepare this presentation.
Thank you. So one of the questions is, and it goes a little bit more to the California Voting Rights Act that talks about the boundaries for cities and counties. As I understand it, that was not something which your commission addressed. Do you know much about, okay, whether those for cities and counties, whether they can look at communities of interest or whether it has to be pure population based?
Well, I mean, it's always population based because it's one person, one vote. You can't mess with that. But as most of communities of interest, I would say the at-large election is pretty much a thing of the past. In order to provide the opportunity for people of color, if you will, or other minority groups to elect people that they want to see represent them. And so it's most communities of interest. It's got to be population, and the population. It's interesting because we had to just deal with that at our level because our districts are so large. If you had a variation of 0.5%, that can make 18,000 person difference. Whereas if you only had 50,000 people in your district, which is what the Midwest has, a lot of the states, 10% is only 5,000 people. So at the state level and local level, you're given more latitude in having equal population, but not the congressional level. So it's population and then community of interest, and there's some obvious things. For example, I'll give you one at the state level we had for Congress. When we looked at the map, starting out, we took Gold Gate to be a hard boundary because we had testimony in Santa Rosa from people in Marin County. At that time, there was 100,000 people in Marin County into us in the San Francisco district. And they said, we have nothing in common with San Francisco. And we agreed with them. I mean, and so we took Golden Gate as a hard line to draw north and to draw south. And within a city, you might have a freeway that is exactly the same thing. You just can't cross the freeway. It makes no sense to cross the freeway, to have 50 people on the other side of the freeway in this district. So you draw the line at the freeway. I mean, there'd be things like that, that just common sense kind of splits that you would pursue.
So there are a few questions about Congressional District number 3, which I believe, based on the questions I'm seeing, is Congressmember Ami Bera's district, including some questions about how is it possibly a community of interest, considering it goes, and you may not know specifically about that district, since it goes from North Amador to fairly south, etc. I guess there are a couple of attendees that are not thrilled, perhaps, with the Congress members' new district lines.
Well, I have to say, remember, you got to get to 760,000 people. And that just divides itself into nice little neat blocks. I mean, if you got to reach down to grab a certain pop, as I said, the northern part of Sacramento, I think, Natomas and such, is going to be in a different district because you had to get to 760,000 people. And that's just what you have to do. And I mean, you have to move people around as best you can. So you may have to make trade-offs. You say, okay, is it better that this group be with this district so we can make this district someplace else, or vice versa? And again, it's the numbers that drive that. Because it's all hard. I mean, if you look at some of the districts, like, in fact, I found my Politico thing. This is of California. It says Politico. And it has a map. It doesn't show up too well. The red districts are strong Trump. The purple ones, no, the purple is strong Trump. The blue ones are strong Biden. And the orange ones are competitive, supposedly. But no, purple's competitive, sorry. Orange is Trump. But you can see, I don't know if you can tell what's going to show up, but this is one district. Almost.
Yeah, if you could hold it a little bit higher, it does show up well. Thank you.
Okay. You can see the orange up in the north of the state, that represents one district, or the ones that go down through the desert. If you go down to Bishop and Lone Pine, you got to go a long way to get districts, and you really can't cross the mountains, because what happens is that, and you'll see that on the coast, we don't cross the Trinity Mountains because we try to make it accessible all year long to whoever's representing that area. Highway, you can't go across 120 in the wintertime over Tioga Pass. It's closed. You can't go over the Trinity Alps in the wintertime. Same reason, it's closed. So you got to pick up your population where you can to get to your 760. That's just practical application stuff.
And so I think one of the questions is whether if you have two communities of interest, or two communities of interest which are fairly similar, but they're not contiguous, any way to lump them together?
No, it depends how far apart they are, but we're required to make the districts compact and contiguous. I mean, you can't have an island here and an island here. Can't do that. And you want to have a fairly close, as best you can, to get 760,000 people together. You don't want to have loops over here and gather up this population. I mean, that's what gerrymandering does. It draws these. There was one when we had a map that dealt with the Central Valley in 2010, 2011. It came right up 99, 50 miles into Stockton and grabbed a population. And that's nuts. I mean, we thought, and there was one district that went down the coast. And when the tide came in, it was cut in half. We just, that kind of, I mean, sure, they may have had bed risks because they're absolutely both coastal, but it made no sense to have a district like that.
So last question for you. How long does the process take from day one? So there's the And let me talk about 2 steps of the process. You talked about the application process. It would be interesting to know from day 1 to when the members are finally selected, how long that process took. And then once the members are, I don't know, sworn in or they begin the process, how long from beginning to end of that?
Yeah, there's 2 questions. And so a little bit more about the selection process. I would say that we had to apply in June of 2010. Okay. And we had to write 4 essays. We had to get letters of recommendation. We had to get all of our financial data out there. If you wanted to have privacy, you didn't want to apply for the job. Then we had, with the process, we got whittled down. And finally, they got down to 120. Those 120 got 90-minute live interviews. Then 60 of that 120 were picked and went to the legislature. It's the only time the legislature touched the process. They were able, each legislator was able to blackball two people. And so we got down to a group of just 36 of us, 12 Republicans, 12 Democrats, 12 declined to state. They picked 8 of those, 3, and 2 independents. Then those 8 got together and picked the other 6. Because again, they wanted to make this, because what happened was that it turned out that just randomly, of the first 8, 4 were Asian. So, you know, and we had 1 Latino, which said this is not going to work. So we no more Asians, but we pulled in Latinos that were, you know, that have gotten to that the point of the final 36. And so we were able to use that process to be sure that we had the right number of women, because we were 7, and we ended up being 7 and 7, and the right number of ethnic groups. So we were done January 1st for that process. Then we had to create a state commission or state agency. So we used from January 1st to March to create a state agency out of whole cloth. Then the census data came in April, and we started to draw maps. We had draft maps out by June. We took public comment on that. People said, "Oh, stupid you do. How could you possibly do that?" So then we met for a month every day at McGeorge Law School with TV cameras and everything else going on. People could come and watch us do it live because they could comment live on what we were doing. And we had a month to draw the maps. So we had to get them to the state Secretary of State by July 31st in order to meet an August 15th deadline. In fact, actually this time, because of the COVID and the delayedness of the census, the commission had to go to the state Supreme Court and get the dates pushed back because they couldn't do it by August 15th because they didn't have the data. And so they had to get it done. I think it was end of December that they were given it to actually come up with the maps. So the line drawing took about 2 months, maybe 3 months, actual line drawing, everyday kind of deal, and public hearings, that kind of stuff to gather people's community of interest input. The selection process took 6 or 7 months.
Thank you. This has been very, very interesting. I'm going to turn things back to Chris, who I think will do the wrap up.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot. And as part of our thank you to our Renaissance members, a small thank you gift, we'd like to offer you an honorary membership in the Renaissance Society.
Thank you.
And we'll also be making a donation in your name to the Seth Nelson Student Emergency Grant Fund.
Great. I appreciate that.
So today's presentation was recorded, and you can see it on the Renaissance Society Forum channel on YouTube or through the Renaissance website. There's a link on that. So next Friday, our March 18th, Steve Beck's going to be talking about the real John Sutter and his world from 1834 to 1846. Steve Beck is a retired director of the Sacramento Historical Society and was the historian, archivist, and educational programming director at Sutter's Fort and the California State Indian Museum from 1998 to 2018. Using dozens of rare photographs and maps, he will grace us with the tales of John Sutter, who in 1839 introduced and established Western civilization in the Sacramento Valley of Mexican California. So we hope you'll join us next week. We'll see you then.